Thank you. Amen. Jesus has something to say just about every aspect of life in this teaching that he lays out. Something to say about life on earth and life in God's realm, God's kingdom. And so today he talks about money. Something on earth, as well as he talks about it as a treasure in heaven. Now, we don't talk about money a whole lot in church, except for maybe during that October time when we're trying to build a budget in our stewardship time. But we do know that money is part of our everyday life, and the way we relate to money can bring joy. The way we relate to money can also bring pain. It can be a heart-lifting experience or a heart-breaking experience. Many of us can share stories about money. When I was little in middle school, I earned my money babysitting. In those days, this tells you the age, I got paid 25 cents an hour to babysit. Some of you might have who got paid less than that to babysit? Anybody got paid less than 25 cents an hour? Oh my goodness, I wasn't charging enough then in that case. And I saved up my money because I wanted to get my mother something as a gift for her birthday. And so I found on the corner Weinbach and Lincoln, Weinbach Pharmacy in Evansville, this lovely blown glass statue bird, a blue bird, and I thought it was perfect. My mother collected glass birds, and so I got my sisters together, and together we pooled our hard-earned money and bought that bird for our mother, and she loved it. She loved it so much that she has moved probably 5 or 6 times in the meantime, and that has made the cut every move she's made. As a matter of fact, I was just there over Christmas, and there it was on her shelf. An experience of joy. That I saved money and I sacrificed things that I could have bought other things at the time, but I wanted to buy that for my mother. I had another experience that wasn't quite so joyful. By this time in high school, I had earned my way up. I was now making $2 a half an hour teaching piano lessons, and so the money rolled in really quickly. And so I decided I was going to buy myself a dress. My first dress I bought with my own money. I bought it for a special occasion. I wore it to that occasion. I felt so special, so wonderful, and unfortunately I spilled a little something on it, so I went to the washing. When that dress came out, it wasn't a dress anymore. It was maybe a doll dress. Lost its body. All the colors had faded together. The dress was not all it was meant to be. Something didn't turn out so well. So you see, sometimes money brings us joy, sometimes not. And sometimes it's heart-lifting, sometimes heartbreaking, and that's what our passage talks about today. Matthew 6, verse 19 starts with a common sense warning. Let me read that one more time. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. Now, we know the stuff of the earth will wear out and break down and let us down. We all know this. We know that the cars that are once brand new and shiny will eventually rust. We know that our cell phones that are once the most in thing will eventually become obsolete or they'll break. We know that our long-term savings can go down. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong to have a car or a good phone or long-term savings. It's just that the realistic picture is that these things don't last. We know that. And Jesus reminds us of this as common sense because the same thing can happen to our hearts. Because you see, our heart follows our treasures. And if we let our hearts get attached to those things that we treasure in this world, our hearts are at risk, just as our treasures are. Where your treasure is, there your hearts will be. This is just a general truth about our own human experience. Hearts and treasures move together. And we need to learn that if we are to grasp Jesus' teaching about hearts and about money. Hearts and treasures move together. But money really isn't what we actually treasure, truth be told. And a little piece of paper that's green and has some nice filigree pictures on it isn't all exciting in and of itself. And even the material things that money can't buy aren't exactly what we treasure, but it's really the things that money and material things symbolize, what they mean to us That's what they do in our hearts. That's what Jesus is talking about. For example, sometimes we treasure money or the material things that money can buy because they give us this measure of comfort and pleasure. And so we start to chase the comfort and pleasure because that feels like what a full life is supposed to be to us. They symbolize that comfort and pleasure, the good life. And sometimes we use money and material things that money can buy because we think it will give us status. People will think well of us. We'll have nice things, a good job. People will look up at us a different way. And status becomes our picture of what we view as the good life. Sometimes the way we view money or the things material things money can buy is because it makes us feel secure. And security becomes our vision of a good life. And so we seek pleasure and status and security, but they can never live up to the expectations we have for them any more than that dress could live up to the expectation I had that it was going to make me beautiful forever. Because pleasure is just pleasure. It's not joy, even though we try to substitute it for joy sometimes. Status is just status, not a relationship, even though we try to substitute that for it sometimes. Security, although it does at times reduce risk, it can never actually keep us safe. And when we let our hearts get attached to these things that bring comfort or pleasure or security, our heart is at risk of going down because hearts and treasures move together. And Jesus names that problem. But he doesn't leave us there with that problem. He gives us a new way of understanding treasure. Store up treasures in heaven, he says, because that treasure will last. That treasure won't let you down. Now, this is a challenge saying because Jesus doesn't spell out what treasure in heaven is. Jesus doesn't spell out how we should get this treasure to store it up. You kind of feel like you should know what he's talking about, but he really doesn't say it in here, does he? Well, maybe the reason he doesn't have to explain what treasure in heaven is because he's already been talking about it from the time he began gathering and teaching his disciples. He's already explaining treasure in heaven. He's teaching about what it is like to live in God's world, in God's reign. He's teaching us every time he lifts up the values of God's realm in heaven, not only now, but forever. He describes treasure in heaven in the Beatitudes, those teachings that reminds us that we are blessed by God. Do you remember what he says? He says, "You are blessed, period." Comfort comes from knowing you are blessed. Status comes from knowing you are a child of God. Security comes from God's power, not from any of these treasures on earth. Treasure on heaven is knowing the blessing of comfort, even when you mourn. It's knowing peace even when there is chaos. It's knowing fullness even when you don't know what's next. It's knowing the joy of giving mercy and receiving mercy. Treasure of heaven is knowing that joy even in the midst of persecution and pain, when people mutter against you. That's what treasure in heaven is, knowing that blessing in the midst of a very, very imperfect world. Treasure in heaven, he goes on to say, is claiming your light and shining your light. Treasure in heaven, he says, is flavoring the world with those things of God, salting the world. Treasure in heaven, he says, is repaying evil with good. Treasure in heaven is selfless giving, selfless living, giving that gives on and gives on without drawing attention to yourself. That's what treasure in heaven is, he preaches. Treasure in heaven is learning to pray the way Jesus taught, a vibrant life of prayer. It's forgiving and sharing and giving and loving and blessing and knowing you belong to God. You see, treasure in heaven is what Jesus came to bring, to announce, to explain, and to live. I did a little exercise this week. Now, I know what treasure on earth looks like, particularly on days like this when I can kind of see the rust start building up in my car with all the salt on the roads, particularly on days like this when I can see my driveway cracking even more because of all the chemicals on there. I know what treasure on earth looks like, even here when we can see some of the things starting to crumble in our own building. But I wanted to see with my own eyes treasure in heaven might look like. And so I did a little tour of our church. And I walked first through the Sunday school rooms. And in those Sunday school rooms, I could hear people sharing deeply their lives, their wisdom, praying for one another, blessing one another, knowing one another as God's children. And I thought, that's treasure in heaven. I walked into the children's worship and wonder space, and I could visualize the children opening their eyes and ears and hearts in wonder, hearing what God's love is like, finding hope and love of Jesus Christ instead of all those other empty promises that come and compete for their priorities and time. And then I walked into the great hall, and I saw in my mind what happens here every Sunday morning when people come out of the cold, come get a nice warm breakfast, when people are prayed for and prayed with, when people are served because they're God's children, and that's treasure in heaven. And Thursday and Friday nights when that's the only place they have to sleep, and people are served and given a warm place to stay because they are God's children, period. Treasure in heaven. And then I walked into the chapel gathering space here. And the first thing that came to my heart and mind was what happened a couple weeks ago when all these children in their pajamas, and their parents in their pajamas too, even Marie in her pajamas, came and were in rapt attention as Bill Vanderreet read them this amazing story of God's presence and love for them, and they took it all in. Treasure in heaven. And then I thought about how yesterday our people walked the streets sharing the good news of Habitat, and how a few weeks ago we were sharing the good news at Hoosier Hills Food Bank, and here, treasure in heaven, giving, serving. And then I came into the sanctuary. And I looked up into the baptistry, and I remembered my own baptism and the blessing I felt. I remembered baptizing many of you. I remembered holding some of you as babies, as young children, and walking you down the aisle, reminding you that you are blessed. I remember the organ swelling up and filling my heart and mind and body and spirit with God's blessing. Treasures in heaven. As we come forward for communion, or receive communion every Sunday morning, receive that treasure in heaven in that bread and wine. And then my mind got to going to places like the sacrifices that I have made and that you have made in order to live and receive and know treasures in heaven. Through our tithes, through our offerings, through our giving, treasures in heaven abound. And I am so grateful. And you know, we did sacrifice a lot. We still sacrifice a lot of our time and our treasures, our financial money, for this place to lift up treasures in heaven. But you know, isn't that what Jesus did? Isn't that what Jesus is talking about? Sacrificing of self, giving of self for the sake of joy, for the sake of blessedness, for the sake of treasure. Isn't that what he did on the cross? Hebrews 12 talks about what Jesus did when it says that Jesus endured the cross for the joy of those he treasured. He treasured you and me. He endured the cross not for comfort, not for the sake of security, not for the sake of status, but for the joy that comes in trusting a God who loves the world, blesses the world, period. And that's good news, my friends. Jesus didn't just say, store up treasures in heaven. He did by his giving and by his living. You know, there's lots of pictures that come to our mind, and we need to ask ourselves, what do I treasure? What do you treasure? If you had a big picture frame on your living room wall that had a picture of your treasure or treasures, what would it be? And if we ask ourselves honestly, I know I ask myself honestly, I know that there probably be as many, if not more, earthly treasures in that picture than there would be heavenly treasures. But there's a way to start moving from earthly to heavenly treasures, because you see, our heart follows our treasure. Through intentional living, through prayer, through worship, through praise, through serving, our heart can begin to follow our treasure. Through associating with people who are already alive with heavenly treasure, alive with love and joy, through relationships, we can start treasuring those things of heaven even more. And finally, through how we spend our checkbooks, our time, intentionally about those heavenly treasures, our heart will follow. It takes intention, it takes in love, it takes sacrifice, it takes investment, it takes priorities. But as we know, where your treasure is, there will be your heart. Amen.